We are here today to learn about the Chesapeake Bay and one of the animals that lives in it. So, to begin talking about the bay, we'll start talking about the location. Now, the Chesapeake Bay is connected to an ocean. It's connected to the Atlantic Ocean toward the bottom, and at the top, there are a series of connecting rivers and streams that flow into the bay. So, what happens is that you get salt water coming from the bottom and fresh water coming from the top. Okay, so the bay is a mixture of fresh and salt water. A mix of fresh and salt water is referred to as brackish water. Now, how scientists measure salinity is the amount of grams of salt in a kilogram of water, and those units are called parts per thousand, or you might see it as PPT. So that's how you measure salinity. And the salinity of brackish water is going to be between zero point 0.5 and 30 parts per thousand. So if you live in the mid-Atlantic, chances are you are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. The bay is a huge estuary, and it has an even bigger watershed. The watershed is a representation of all of the pieces of land that have streams and rivers that act as tributaries into the bay. Think of it as a big drainage basin. Everything that hits the ground in that area runs into the bay. So there are 6 states that are in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Those 6 states are Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and New York. Washington, D.C. also is in the watershed, but it is not a state. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone in the watershed has a role to play in helping the Chesapeake Bay become a healthier place for plants, animals, and human beings to live. So we're going to explore what kind of animals live in the bay, and we're going to learn about one animal specifically that helps keep the bay a healthy place. Here we have a picture of an ecosystem. Ecosystem is a term that refers to the interactions of living and non-living things in a specific place. So the scientific word for living is biotic, and the scientific word for non-living is abiotic. Okay, so let's take a look at this ecosystem and see if we can point out any examples of biotic things. Take a second to see if you can find any living organisms. Okay, now looking at the same ecosystem picture, let's now take note of the abiotic features of the ecosystem, which are majorly important. We may see things like birds and frogs and think that that's what makes up nature, but there are also a lot of other non-living things that are essential for living things. So for the biotic features or living organisms in the picture, we have a few different types of bird, snake, see insect, smaller microscopic organisms, of course the grass. And for abiotic things in this photo, we of course have the soil, the air, and the water. And there are some other minerals and smaller abiotic things that aren't pictured but are there. An oyster has 2 hard shells and a soft, gooey body inside. The body inside is where the gills, mouth, heart, stomach, and other vital organs are held. Has anybody ever eaten an oyster before? It's an experience. You eat the soft part when you eat an oyster. When an oyster is young, it doesn't look anything like adult oysters, right? So if you think about a baby human, baby humans look similar to adult humans. You think about a baby kitten or a baby puppy, they look very similar to the adult versions of those animals. A little bit different with oysters. Oyster babies look very different from oyster adults. To start off the oyster life cycle, oysters put millions of eggs into the water, and millions of sperm are released into the water at the same time. It may seem like a lot, but most of those eggs will not survive to be adults or even make it to the larval stage. After eggs are fertilized, they will develop into larvae. Larvae is a term that you may associate with insects, but oysters have larvae too. Oysters have two different stages of larvae. If you look closely at our picture of the life cycle and our microscopic pictures of oyster larvae, you can see some small hairs that the oysters use to swim around. Now, the oysters are moving around freely in the water, swimming because they're looking for somewhere to land. The oysters are looking for a hard substrate to cement themselves down on and start the next part of their lives. Some common hard substrates include rocks, docks, but especially other oysters. Once the larvae have cemented themselves down to a hard surface, they are then referred to as spat. So in order to cement themselves down, larval oysters will grow what's called a foot. And they'll use this foot to feel around and make sure they're on a hard substrate. Once an oyster has chosen a location, it will secrete a very strong cement-like glue, settle itself down, and grow the other half of its shell. And it will live the rest of its life in that very spot. Creatures that do this are known as sessile. It means that they don't move. You can imagine trees, things like mussels, sponges, coral, barnacle. These living things are sessile. They're not going to move. Next up, we have a quick video that shows how oyster larvae develop. Now let's explore the adult phase of the oyster life cycle. Oftentimes, oysters will cement themselves onto the shells of other adult oysters. As this continues to happen and clusters of oysters grow, these clusters are referred to as reefs, and they can become very important features to an ecosystem. Not only do they offer young oysters protection, but also smaller fish and other animals will use these features to hide from predators. Let's explore a bit more about where oysters live. All living organisms need a habitat to survive. So a habitat is made up of four main parts. Every living creature needs water to survive. So water is a crucial part to any habitat. We already reviewed what special type of water the oysters need, and it is called brackish. Good job. So in that water are nutrients. Some of those nutrients help the oyster maintain a hard shell. We have bones, and we need nutrients to help our bones stay strong. Calcium. So the calcium that is found in sea salt, the same calcium that helps our bones stay strong, calcium helps the oyster's shells stay strong. Another part of any healthy ecosystem is a sufficient food supply. Now picture this. Your feet are cemented to the earth, and you can't run around to chase down your food. So how do you eat? Well, the oyster solves this problem by letting its food come to it. So an oyster will suck water into its body through its gills to trap a tiny kind of food called plankton. So plankton are microscopic plants or animals that are floating in the water, and oysters love to eat plankton, specifically phytoplankton. So the same action, the same pumping action that the oyster uses to breathe with its gills is the same action that's used for feeding. As water moves in and out of the body of the oyster, small hairs trap the food. Coming up, I have a quick video for you to watch an oyster feeding up close. So oysters have great filtering ability, and they are known to be able to filter entire bodies of water. So I have a quick video that shows us the filtering power of these oysters. Pretty cool, huh? So, the next thing our oysters are going to need in their habitat is something that we touched on earlier, and that is shelter. Oysters need protection. They have plenty of creatures that enjoy them. Then they need to have shelter and be able to protect themselves. In addition to their hard shell, oysters tend to live in clusters, which offer strength in numbers. And the last thing that a habitat needs may seem kind of arbitrary, but it is space. So these oysters, they need space. If an area is too crowded, some of these other resources may not be available, and it may make it harder to live. You can imagine sharing your bedroom with your entire family. Might be okay for the first few hours, but eventually everyone is going to want and need more space. So one of the animals that coexist with the oyster is called the tube worm. Tube worms are able to burrow into the oyster shell without harming the oyster. So they are benefiting from the reefs. They get protection. The worms are not considered a parasite because they do not harm the oyster. Here is another animal in the same habitat. Barnacles, another sessile animal, can also find homes in oyster reefs. So you might see a oyster shell with barnacle shells on top of it, attached to it. So here we have a picture of an animal called an oyster toadfish, right? So the oyster toadfish feeds on oysters. It's one of their predators. You may be wondering how the oyster toadfish deals with the tough shell of the oyster. Well, it has a really, really sharp set of teeth that it uses to crack open the shell and get inside. This fish also has a really large range. It can be found from Maine all the way down to Florida. Some other names it goes by are ugly toad, oyster cracker, oyster catcher, and it has a venomous spine on its dorsal fin. Its sting has been compared to that of a wasp. What we have here is a very simple illustration of a food chain that you might see in an oyster habitat. To start things off, the plankton is getting its energy from the sun. Yes. The plankton gets its energy from the sun and then transfers its energy to the oyster. The oyster filter feed and eat the plankton, right? And we just finished describing the oyster toadfish. So the oyster toadfish is a predator. The energy from the oyster will go to the fish. So are oysters important to the ecosystem? And the answer is absolutely yes. Not only do oysters offer food for predators, but oysters are essential in filtering the water. The health of oyster populations is also vitally important to fishermen and watermen who depend on the sales for their livelihood. Oyster farming, also known as aquaculture, is a practice that has been done for thousands of years where people control the growth of oysters. Now let's watch a quick video to learn a bit more about how oyster aquaculture is done. Unfortunately, oyster numbers in the wild have gone down dramatically. Well, you have pollution, litter, also overfishing by humans, predators, and you also have disease. An early English description of the bay by John Smith said that the oyster reefs were so high they actually were a hazard to his boat. And there were so many oysters in the Chesapeake Bay at the time that they could filter the entire Chesapeake Bay in less than a week. That is astoundingly over 18 trillion gallons of water. Amazing. Presently, the amount of oysters in the bay, it would take them over a year to do the same thing. Here are a few things you can do to promote healthy oyster ecosystems. Volunteer with some local groups planting trees or aquatic vegetation. This is great for preventing erosion and ensuring the water stays clear. You could also set up rain barrels at your home or school. This catches rain that would turn to runoff and increase pollution. And you can simply advocate for oysters to your family and friends. If you're unable to volunteer your time, donations to well researched causes and organizations are very helpful. So I'd like to thank you all for joining me. I hope you learn more about the Chesapeake Bay and oysters and how you can play a role in helping us live in a safe and healthy world.